Mississippi nights have a way of lying to you. The air hangs thick, warm, and deceptively still, like the whole world's asleep, dreaming sweet dreams. But not Daniel Crowder. Oh no, Sheriff Crowder wasn't the kind of man who dreamed. He was the kind who took. For nearly 20 years, he'd worn the badge like a crown. In this small, God-fearing county, his word wasn't just law, it was gospel. People nodded when he passed, women lingered a moment too long when they shook his hand, and men avoided his stare. Because Daniel didn't take no from anyone. Not from his deputies. Not from the women who smiled at him in church. And certainly not from the drifters who passed through town like summer storms, hot, violent, and gone by morning. At 45, he still had the frame of a man who worked out twice a week, but he drank like he didn't care. A salt and pepper beard, trimmed sharp, boots polished to a mirror, badge gleaming under the courthouse lights. He loved to remind people that law and order began with fear. And God help them, nobody wore fear better than Sheriff Crowder. That night, he wasn't supposed to be anywhere near Rosie's Tavern. He'd told his wife he was pulling a double shift. Serious business at the station, he'd said. But the streets were quiet. The jail was empty except for a couple drunks. The only noise in town was the lazy buzz of cicadas under a July sky. And Daniel Crowder was bored. Rosie's was that kind of place where married men forgot they were married. Where the bourbon was cheap and the lights stayed dim enough to hide your sins. A jukebox groaned in the corner. Cigarette smoke curled in the air. And then he saw her. She was sitting at the far end of the bar, alone. Red hair like wildfire. The kind you don't run from, even though you should. Skin pale as moonlight. A dress so tight it might as well have been painted on. One leg crossed over the other, slow, deliberate, as if she'd been waiting all night for the exact right man to walk through that door. And Daniel Crowder was that man. If only he'd known. That was the night his power, his pride, his manhood would all be torn away. She called herself Tessa Rourke. The name rolled off her tongue like smoke. Sweet, slow, dangerous. But the voice beneath it. Oh, there was something sharper there. Like a blade wrapped in silk. Daniel swaggered up to the bar, leaning one elbow on the counter. I'm the sheriff around here, he said, the way he always did. Expecting the flash of admiration, the flirtatious laugh, the eager lean in. But Tessa didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Instead, she smiled. Slowly, like she'd already read the entire story of his life, and she knew exactly how it ended. He bought her a drink, something pink and sweet in a tall glass. She accepted, but didn't thank him. They talked, though calling it a conversation would be generous. She asked questions that felt like tests. He answered like a man used to passing everyone. But there was an undercurrent in her gaze, an unspoken, I already know what kind of man you are. And for Daniel Crowder, that only made her more irresistible. They didn't waste time. The room key was paid for in cash. Motel 17, far beyond the last streetlight, tucked behind a wall of pine trees and broken dreams. The wallpaper was stained. The air conditioner wheezed like it was dying. The sheets had seen better decades. But Daniel didn't notice. All he saw was her. The dress hit the floor first, then the heels. Her skin smelled of cinnamon and danger, and when she kissed him, it was like falling into a memory he never had but always wanted. She whispered things in his ear he hadn't heard since college. Words meant to make a man forget the rest of the world existed. And God, did he forget? One round, then another, then another. 10 in total. 10 different positions. 10 times he thought he might collapse. From pleasure, from exhaustion, from something he couldn't name. Outside, the night deepened. The crickets sang. The air conditioner coughed and sputtered, but inside, the room was thick with heat and sweat. He didn't care that his body ached, that his head swam. He felt alive. By the time dawn bled over the horizon, Tessa was gone. No goodbye, no number, not even a dent in the pillow where her head had been. And Daniel Crowder didn't mind. He zipped up, looked at himself in the cracked motel mirror, and grinned. Still got it, he whispered. By noon, he was back at the station, boots up on his desk, spinning the tale to Deputy Klein, calling it his middle-aged resurrection, boasting about Tessa like she was a trophy only he could win. She had a mouth like scripture, he laughed, and hips that could convert the devil himself. The men in the office roared. The badge gleamed, and Daniel Crowder felt untouchable. But even then, Even as the last echoes of laughter faded from the walls, something else had already come back with him from that motel room. Something alive, something squirming, something waiting, and it was just getting started. It began as an itch. Harmless, almost laughable. The kind of irritation you blame on cheap motel sheets or too much friction from a long night. By 3 p.m., Sheriff Daniel Crowder was leaning back in his office chair, shifting uncomfortably. A bead of sweat slid down his temple. He adjusted his belt, scratched, discreetly, under the desk. Deputy Klein was in the middle of a story, but Daniel wasn't listening anymore. The itch had grown hotter, sharper, like fire ants, crawling under his skin. He stood, muttered something about stretching his legs, and headed for the bathroom. Inside, the light flickered overhead. He unzipped his pants, muttering under his breath, half expecting a rash, maybe a blister. But what he saw in that cracked mirror above the sink made his breath freeze in his chest. Red, inflamed, pulsing. And then, something moved. Not a twitch of muscle, not a reflex. Something small, something white, something wriggling. Oh, God! He staggered back, eyes wide, leaned in again, praying he'd imagined it. And that's when it happened. From the tip, a single, glistening maggot slid out. It curled on the porcelain sink like it was tasting the air. A sound ripped from Daniel's throat. Not a yell, not a curse, but a scream. A raw, high-pitched, unmanly scream that echoed off the tile walls. Deputy Klein burst through the door. Sheriff? Daniel was hunched over the sink, pants around his ankles, face slick with sweat, eyes wild. He didn't speak. He couldn't. He just pointed. Klein took one look and reeled back so hard he hit the wall. His hand flew to his radio. Dispatch, get EMS to the station now. And send a hazmat unit. I'm not kidding. Within minutes, Daniel was in the back of an ambulance, curled like a wounded animal, clutching himself and gasping. The sirens wailed through town. The EMTs tried to keep professional faces, but one muttered, "Jesus Christ," under his breath. The other turned away and vomited into a trash bag halfway to the hospital. When they wheeled him into the ER at Pinebrook General, Dr. Lauren Stanton took one look and stepped out to catch her breath. It wasn't just the maggots. It was what they'd done. The skin was necrotic, dead, gray-black, sloughing away with every second. The maggots were alive, dozens of them, crawling in and out of pockets of rotting flesh. Lauren had only ever seen something like this once, in a medical journal about illegal biological weapons used in war zones. She ordered an emergency culture. The lab results were worse than anything she'd imagined. This wasn't infection. This wasn't an STD. This was synthetic, engineered, designed to target genital tissue and dissolve it from the inside out. It hadn't been contracted. It had been delivered. As the sedatives took hold, Daniel's lips moved. Over and over. Tessa. Tessa. But there was no Tessa on the motel's guest log. No credit card record. No trace of her in the town's visitor registry. The motel's surveillance footage? Mysteriously erased between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. By nightfall, the decision was made. To save his life, they had to take it. They removed everything. All of it. When Daniel Crowder woke, the pain was dulled by morphine. But the truth hit harder than any scalpel could. The part of him he'd once defined himself by, the part he'd bragged about that very morning, was gone. Not stolen. Not lost. Erased. And no one could tell him why, or who had done it. Not yet. For hours, Sheriff Daniel Crowder lay under the cold fluorescence of Pinebrook General's isolation ward. Morphine dulled the agony in his groin, but nothing could numb the truth that had been cut from him. He kept asking for answers. Nobody had them. Dr. Lauren Stanton stood at the foot of his bed, chart in hand, her jaw tight. She'd seen violence before, gunshot wounds, car crashes, stabbings, and drunken bar fights. But this wasn't nature. It wasn't even accident. It was design. The lab report in her hand read like something out of a nightmare. A synthetic enzyme, not found in any known infection, cultivated to do one thing: liquefy male genital tissue. Not just kill it, dissolve it. The enzyme was laced with biological triggers: heat, friction, pressure. Once activated, it soaked through latex, lay dormant for hours. Then, when the body was relaxed, it woke up and began to eat. Lauren had read about experimental compounds like this in banned medical research, whispers of behavioral enzymes developed for use in war zones, designed to disable enemy combatants without killing them outright. But this was targeted with surgical precision. Someone had put it inside him, and she already knew how. The memories from the night before weren't hard to piece together. Daniel had been with a woman, red hair, pale skin, a tight dress. He'd said her name was Tessa, but Tessa Rourke didn't exist. Not in the motel's log, not in the state's records. And the surveillance system had a perfect 6-hour blackout during the exact window they'd have been together. "Do you remember anything else?" she asked him quietly. Daniel's lips were cracked, his eyes bloodshot. She had this scar, he muttered, right above her hip bone. Like someone tried to cut her in half, and she survived. Lauren froze. She'd heard of scars like that before. Years ago, on a girl who'd come into her ER with injuries no one wanted to report. But before she could ask more, the door opened. 2 men in dark suits stepped inside, FBI. One introduced himself as Special Agent Michael Carter from the Bureau's Biological Threat Division. The other didn't give a name. They didn't waste time. They wanted the culture results, the tissue samples, and every scrap of evidence from the motel. "This isn't an isolated incident," Carter said flatly. "We've seen something like this before, but never this advanced." Daniel stared at him, eyes narrowing. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Carter replied, "that whoever did this to you has done it before." "And the men they targeted? None of them survived." For the first time since waking, Daniel's voice broke. "You think she's going to come back?" Carter's expression didn't change. "No, Sheriff. She already got what she came for." The words hung in the air like smoke. Lauren knew then. This wasn't just a one-off act of violence. This was a message. And somewhere out there, the woman with the red hair was already walking away. 3 days after the surgery, Daniel Crowder sat propped up in a hospital bed. The once commanding man was gone. In his place was a pale, hollow-eyed patient tethered to a catheter bag. The nurses avoided his gaze. The deputies who visited didn't stay long. The county he'd once ruled with a smirk now whispered behind diner counters. 10 times in one night, and by morning, they'd taken it all. But the real storm was gathering in a cramped conference room downstairs. Special Agent Michael Carter was sitting at a table strewn with manila folders, his tie loosened, eyes locked on a single sheet of paper. It was an internal affairs complaint, dated 5 years ago, filed by a 19-year-old girl from Biloxi. Name: Nia Rourke. Her handwriting was shaky, but the words cut like a blade. She claimed then Deputy Daniel Crowder had arrested her for public intoxication and raped her in a holding cell. She described the smell of whiskey on his breath, the way he called her a nobody, the way he stuffed her underwear into her mouth so no one could hear her scream. She had begged for medical attention. She never got it. The report had been stamped with 2 words in red ink. Not credible. Reason? Prior drug history. No physical evidence. The supervisor's signature sealed her fate. The file was buried. No charges. No investigation. No justice. Carter leaned back in his chair, jaw clenched. He'd seen this pattern before. Accusations against men in uniform, swallowed whole by the system meant to hold them accountable. When he took the file to Daniel's hospital room, the sheriff's face went slack. He didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it either. He just stared out the window, silent. Was it her? Carter pressed. Was Tessa Rourke really Nia Rourke? Daniel's lips twitched, the ghost of a smirk, or maybe just pain. "I told you," he muttered. "She had a scar right above the hip." That was all Carter needed. Because in case files kept under lock at the Bureau, there were whispers of women like her. Women who had survived sexual violence, vanished from public record, and reappeared years later, with bodies that had been altered, weaponized. And in the darkest corners of those files, one name surfaced more than once. Nia Rourke. The pieces began to align. This wasn't a random act. It wasn't lust gone wrong. It was a debt being collected. And Daniel Crowder, for the first time in his life, was powerless to stop it. Special Agent Michael Carter had chased violent men his whole career. Arms dealers, cartel enforcers, bomb makers. But nothing in his FBI training had prepared him for this. On his desk lay the latest intel, photos, autopsy reports, classified lab memos stamped eyes only. The pattern was undeniable. In the last 3 years, there had been 5 confirmed fatalities across Louisiana, Alabama, and South Carolina. All men in positions of power. All dead from the same cause, rapid-onset genital necrosis caused by a synthetic enzyme. all within days of a sexual encounter with an unidentified woman. And every one of those men had something else in common. They'd all been accused, formally or informally, of sexual misconduct. Every single allegation had been buried. The deeper Carter dug, the darker it got. Whispers from field offices. Memos from cases closed without prosecution. Survivors too scared, or too silenced, to speak on record. One analyst in Quantico gave it a name: biological retribution. Not a gang, not a cartel, not even a single, cohesive cell. It was a network, a shadow web of women, survivors, who had disappeared from the system that failed them, only to re-emerge with the means to deliver a justice the courts never could. Carter read the internal brief 3 times. They didn't just kill. They engineered their kills. Sex wasn't pleasure to them. It was bait. Bodies rebuilt not for intimacy, but for execution. Lab-grown necrotic tissue laced with that enzyme. Dormant until triggered by heat and friction, able to seep through latex and activate hours later. Condoms didn't help. Once it was inside, the countdown began. Nia Rourke, or Tessa, as Crowder knew her, was one of the most advanced operatives they'd ever seen. The Bureau believed she had undergone extreme genital reconstruction, not for gender reassignment, not for aesthetics, but as a delivery system. And Daniel Crowder? He wasn't even her first. The files laid out the truth in black and white. For other men, all buried quietly. Death certificates citing rare infection or complications. One cremated before an autopsy could be performed. Behind the sterile medical language was the same reality. Groins dissolved into black sludge, maggots feeding on the remains, zero trace of the woman involved. Carter sat back, running a hand over his face. This was no random spree. This was surgical, selective, a campaign. And the targets weren't just any men. They were men protected by uniforms, titles, pulpits, and gavels. In the network's eyes, they were untouchable. Until now. At Pinebrook General, Daniel Crowder was beginning to understand just how far from untouchable he'd fallen. His suspension from the sheriff's department was already on the books. The whispers in town had turned into stares. Protesters gathered outside the station, some demanding justice for him, others holding signs that read, "No tears for rapists." He stayed in his hospital room, blinds drawn, a prisoner to both the infection and the fear. And somewhere out there, the woman who had done this, the woman with the scar, was vanishing into the fog. Carter's team traced what little trail she left. Black market purchases of medical equipment in Haiti. Theft of enzyme precursors from a fertility clinic in Miami. Unregistered shipments routed through Colombia and Eastern Europe. This wasn't improvised revenge. It was a supply chain. The more Carter learned, the more he felt the ground shift beneath him. He wasn't chasing a killer. He was chasing an operation. And Nia Rourke? She was their proof of concept. In the privacy of his notes, Carter wrote something he'd never dare put in an official report. They aren't just symbols of vengeance. They're prototypes. They're building something that can't be stopped by the law, because it is the law they believe in, their own law. The next move wasn't theirs. It was hers. And from what Carter could see, she was just getting started. By the end of the week, Sheriff Daniel Crowder was no longer sheriff. The state had suspended him pending investigation, but titles didn't matter now. He hadn't left his hospital bed, could barely walk, couldn't bear to meet his own reflection. The man who once filled every doorway with his presence now sat hunched and silent, staring through the blinds like a prisoner. Outside, the county was splitting in two. Some saw him as a victim, a lawman targeted by some deranged bioterrorist. Others whispered words like karma. But inside room 312, Daniel wasn't thinking about public opinion. He was thinking about what had been taken and the part of himself he couldn't get back. Lillian Crowder hadn't cried when the doctors told her the surgery had taken everything. She hadn't cried when the FBI swarmed the hospital or when the reporters parked at the end of their driveway. But the day after Daniel's suspension, an envelope appeared in her mailbox. No stamp, no return address, just her name, written in delicate cursive. Inside was a handkerchief, vintage linen, soft to the touch. In one corner, embroidered in blood-red thread, were 3 words. "You're free now." Lillian stood at the kitchen counter for a long time, the handkerchief trembling between her fingers. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a warning. It felt like permission. That night, she went to the upstairs closet. Row after row of freshly pressed uniforms hung there, Daniel's boots lined neatly on the floor. She carried them all out to the backyard, lit a match, and watched the flames swallow the life she'd been forced to play along with for 30 years. Neighbors watched from their windows. No one called the fire department. Back at the hospital, Daniel's morphine drip did little to soften the truth. The blinds stayed closed. The TV stayed off. The man who once barked orders at half the county now barely spoke above a whisper. In the small hours of the morning, nurses swore they heard him mumbling apologies, begging for forgiveness from someone only he could see. Sometimes he just repeated one name, over and over. Nia. 2 days later, he wrote a letter. Not to Lillian. Not to the Bureau. Not to God. It was addressed simply to her. It wasn't a plea for mercy. It wasn't even an apology. It was a question. How long have you waited to kill me? He never sent it. That afternoon, the night nurse found him. Sheets wrapped tight around his neck, eyes fixed on the ceiling. Daniel Crowder had died the way he lived, trying to control something he didn't understand. Daniel Crowder's funeral was held on a gray, rain-slicked Tuesday. The pews were half empty. His widow sat at the front, face unreadable. No one from the state police came. No neighboring sheriffs. Just a scattering of townsfolk. The curious, the confused, and the few who still believed he'd been an innocent man. But in the weeks that followed, his name became just another file in an expanding list. 3 weeks later, in Baton Rouge, a retired Marine colonel was found dead in a hotel room. Cause of death? Identical. Synthetic enzyme. Genital necrosis. Condom still in place. This time, though, there was something new. Taped to the bathroom mirror in thick black marker were 5 words. You didn't listen when we said no. Then came the county judge in Tallahassee. Same symptoms. Same aftermath. But beside the body was a letter, folded neatly, addressed to the system that let him walk free after what he did to me in chambers. The letter ended with one line. Consider this my closing argument. And the pattern kept growing. One by one, men in positions of power began showing up on the Bureau's radar, dead, mutilated, and linked by one chilling common denominator. They all had sealed or dismissed sexual misconduct allegations in their past. Some had victims who'd been too afraid to press charges. Some had cases lost in the labyrinth of legal bureaucracy. Some had used their positions to make sure the accusations never even reached paper. Now, they were being found alone, naked, and rotting from the waist down. Inside FBI headquarters, Carter stood before a corkboard that had grown into a wall. Maps dotted with red pins. Flight paths. Seized chemical shipment logs. Blurred stills from motel surveillance cameras, each showing a different woman, but always, somewhere in the image, a flash of red hair. The analysts had started calling it the Red Dress Protocol. Not an organization. Not a cult. Something more dangerous. A decentralized network without a leader. No manifestos. No funding trail. No online recruitment. Just a shared oath. Passed from survivor to survivor like a torch. If the system fails you, we will not. The media caught wind of fragments. Podcasts ran wild with conspiracy theories. TikTok stitched together shaky timelines. Reddit threads compiled rumors and unverified survivor stories into sprawling dossiers. One post went viral overnight. He took my voice. She took his manhood. Fair trade. Cable news tried to spin it into politics. Talk radio called it reverse rape. But the truth had already seeped into the public bloodstream. Some people whispered the name Nia Rourke like it was a myth. Others swore she was just a ghost story told to keep bad men in line. But in certain corners of the internet, closed forums, encrypted servers, survivor groups that never made headlines, she wasn't a monster. She was a blueprint. And blueprints could be replicated. Carter knew this wasn't going to stop. In a briefing he couldn't record, he told his deputy, "This isn't revenge anymore. This is infrastructure. And every time they take a man down, they're building the next one faster." The room went silent. Because deep down, they all understood, you can fight a killer. You can hunt a terrorist. But how do you fight an idea? Back in Mississippi, the motel where Crowder met Tessa was demolished. Officially, it was condemned for safety violations. Unofficially, it was erased, along with any hope of finding forensic traces. And somewhere far away, the network's work continued. The targets didn't see them coming. They didn't hear the countdown. They never knew, until the itch began. Far from Mississippi, in a shelter just outside Baltimore, Amara Dean sat in front of a cracked laptop screen. She was 22, but her eyes carried the weight of a much older life. She'd been following the news like other people follow religion, searching for signs, proof that something she'd only whispered about in therapy was real. Every headline about Nia Rourke, she saved. Every podcast dissecting the red dress killings, she downloaded. Every Reddit thread trading survivor stories, she read under a fake username. Amara never posted. She just remembered. 3 years earlier, she'd been arrested for a minor charge, nothing violent. No female officer present during booking. The smell of bleach. The slam of a door. The weight of his hand on her throat. The laughter when she cried. The case never went anywhere. It didn't even make it into the paperwork she later requested. Amara told herself she wasn't like Nia Rourke. She wasn't strong. She was still flinching at car doors slamming, still waking up gasping. But when the threads online turned from rumors to patterns, something shifted. Late one night, she got a text from an unknown number. "You don't have to hurt them. You just have to help us aim." She stared at the message for a long time. Her thumb hovered over the screen. Finally, she typed 2 words. "I'm ready." 3 weeks later, a small brown envelope arrived at the shelter. No stamp, no return address, just her name. Inside, a prepaid phone with no SIM card, a thumb drive, a bus ticket to New York, a necklace with a tiny silver charm shaped like a scalpel. On the phone screen was a single line of text. "You won't be asked to bleed, only to guide the blade." When she stepped off the bus, no one met her. She followed the instructions on the drive, 2 subway transfers, a half-mile walk, and a door without a sign. It led to an abandoned trauma center in Queens. The entrance was boarded over, but behind the boards was a stairwell that spiraled down into the earth. At the bottom, a library. Not the kind with children's books and quiet reading corners. This one smelled of paper and electricity, its shelves stacked with old court transcripts, sealed medical records, survivor testimonies, and journals on synthetic biology. Women moved between the stacks like ghosts, some young, some gray-haired, all carrying the same look in their eyes. Not rage, but focus. They didn't speak of killing. They spoke of patterns, of timelines, of how predators hid in plain sight, in clergy robes, in uniforms, in expensive suits. Amara learned quickly. They showed her how files vanished from public record, how one missing comma in a toxicology report could discredit a rape survivor in court, how to read mugshots and spot repeat offenders even after name changes. She was never handed a weapon. Her weapon was information. One woman with a long burn scar down her cheek leaned over Amara's shoulder one night and whispered, "You don't have to be the fire. Just draw the map. We'll burn it all down." Amara nodded. She didn't want revenge. She wanted precision. By the end of the month, her code name appeared in the network's encrypted database, Architect 03. And somewhere, far across the country, a man laughed to a friend about a girl he once drugged and filmed without her consent. 3 days later, his body was found behind a seafood restaurant in Tampa, groin liquefied, blood soaking the dock. Amara read the file. She didn't flinch. She simply typed into the record, "Target confirmed. Delivery successful. No civilian casualties." She closed the laptop. She wasn't Nia Rourke, but she was something just as dangerous. It started with a file, not a headline, not a victim's sobbing confession, just a thin, gray folder that appeared in Amara's inbox on the encrypted network. Subject, Larkin Dennis, age 47, city councilman. On paper, he was a pillar of the community. Married, 3 kids, Sunday school volunteer. Off paper, he had a trail. 2 sealed harassment complaints from junior staffers. A DUI arrest that vanished from the court calendar. A woman's statement in a hospital intake form. He said no one would believe me. Amara's job wasn't to judge. Her job was to confirm. She cross-referenced his travel records with conference rosters, compared them to the survivor statements in the database, checked his political donations, his aliases on hotel receipts, the women he followed on social media. The pattern emerged like a photograph developing in darkroom chemicals. Same cities, same hotels, same nights missing from his public calendar. She tagged the file, pattern confirmed. Risk active. The next step wasn't hers. Somewhere else, maybe in Miami, maybe in Montreal, another woman saw the same file. She didn't contact Amara. She didn't need to. The network didn't work that way. They called them delivery operatives, Women who could walk into a bar and make a predator forget his own name. The system didn't tell Amara where it happened or when. That was by design. The less she knew, the less anyone could pull from her if the wrong people came asking. 1 week later, the report came in. Target: Larkin, Dennis. Status: deceased. Cause: genital necrosis, synthetic enzyme, strain 6B. A brief description followed. Found in a boutique hotel in Richmond. Condom intact. No forced entry. No signs of struggle. The last witness to see him alive, a bartender, said he'd been talking to a woman with auburn hair. She left before he finished his drink. Amara read the report twice. She didn't smile, didn't cheer. She just added her note to the bottom of the file. Delivery successful. No civilian casualties. She closed the laptop and let the silence settle. It wasn't about satisfaction. It wasn't about revenge. It was about the map being correct. The pattern holding. Somewhere out there, another architect was working on the next target. Somewhere else, a delivery operative was already slipping into a red dress. Amara wasn't the one holding the blade, but she knew exactly where to point it. The Riley Torrance file hit the network like a live wire. Riley was 28. A survivor, yes. Her intake record was real enough. She'd been part of a small, radical subforum online that glorified the red dress killings, posting under the handle Scarlet Finale. But she'd grown impatient. Her target, Curtis Ellman, was a middle school history teacher. Widower. No record. No whispers. Nothing in the sealed archives. He didn't match any of the network's filters. Riley's accusation? He'd made inappropriate comments during a Zoom parent-teacher conference. No threats. No physical contact. No corroboration. But Riley didn't wait for verification. She acted alone. She stole a vial of enzyme from a compromised clinic in Arkansas, disguised herself, met Curtis at a downtown Nashville bar. 2 days later, he was dead, the same way Crowder had been. When Amara saw the file, her stomach turned cold. This wasn't justice. This was chaos, and the network moved faster than she'd ever seen. 1 week later, Riley Torrance was found in a motel off Highway 61. No visible wounds. No enzyme. No sign of sexual contact. Stapled to her shirt was a single note. We are not chaos. We are correction. Her name was erased from the archive. Her code revoked. Her signal deleted. Amara stared at the purge log on her screen. The message was clear. The network's power didn't come from rage. It came from precision. If they lost that, if they became just another storm of indiscriminate violence, the world would be right to hunt them. That night, alone at her desk, Amara whispered it to herself like a mantra. This isn't about revenge. It's about restraint. Because in their world, one sloppy kill could destroy everything they'd built. By the following summer, the fear had a life of its own. It didn't need news coverage. It didn't need press conferences. It moved through locker rooms, bachelor parties, police bars, and church parking lots, whispered like gospel. Don't brag. Don't joke. And if she has a scar on her hip, run. Men who'd never worried about consequences now triple-checked condoms. Some stopped cheating. Some canceled late-night counseling sessions with teenage girls. Some cops kept their body cams running for entire shifts. No gaps, no excuses. Fear worked where guilt never had. But for the Bureau, the fear wasn't enough. Behind closed doors, analysts were building a private database. 12 confirmed fatalities in just over a year. Every victim tied to a past allegation buried by the system. No witnesses. No survivors. No suspects. Only a pattern, sharp as glass. Carter called it a silent tribunal. Others called it feminist bioterrorism. The media kept circling the same question. Was Nia O'Rourke still alive? The truth? No one could prove it either way. Some swore she'd been killed years ago. Some said she'd changed everything. Her face, her hair, even her bone structure. And was still out there, slipping in and out of lives like smoke. Amara never asked. Because in the network, Nia wasn't a person anymore. She was a blueprint. An idea. And ideas don't die. Inside that underground library in Queens, Amara's role deepened. She no longer just mapped patterns, she trained others to do it. Quiet girls with shaking hands. Women who still flinched when boots echoed down a hallway. Some of them would never touch an enzyme vial. Some would. All of them would learn how to aim. One evening, Amara reviewed a file on a county prosecutor in Texas. He'd laughed off 3 separate sexual assault accusations. His victims had been called unstable, unreliable, drunks. She marked his file for confirmation. Somewhere else, an operative would decide how the ending would go. Amara didn't feel joy, didn't feel pity. She felt exactness. Because that was what the network had taught her. Justice wasn't a gunshot in the dark. It was a scalpel. In the months ahead, more men would be found. In motel bathrooms, in hotel suites, in private offices, alone, pants around their ankles, their power rotting out of them from the inside. The authorities would keep calling it rare infection and synthetic anomaly. The media would keep calling it a crime wave. But the truth? It was an operation. One that had no headquarters, no manifesto, and no finish line. Somewhere in a city Amara had never been to, a man zipped up his pants and poured himself a drink. He smiled, thinking the night had gone his way. He didn't know the clock had already started. By the time his symptoms began, the itch, the burn, the crawling under the skin, the woman with the red hair would be gone. And maybe she was Nia Rourke. Maybe she was someone Amara had trained. Maybe she was someone brand new. It didn't matter. Because the war Nia had started could no longer be undone. It wasn't just revenge anymore. It was a structure, invisible, untraceable, and spreading. And for the first time in history, the worst thing a man could take from a woman might just be the last thing he ever touched.